This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Renaissance Dam row. Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan inch closer to final deal. Tensions mount as Egyptian police raid Turkey's news agency offices in Cairo. And 1 year later, Kenya remembers victims of hotel attack in which 21 people died. Hello and welcome to CGTN. This is Africa Live and I'm Karen Roberts in Nairobi. Also coming up in the programme. In business, experts call Phase 1 deal between China and the US beneficial to world economy. And in sport, South Africa's Proteas begin third test against England in Port Elizabeth. We begin with the latest on the Nile dispute. Ministers from Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan have agreed to reconvene later this month to finalise an agreement on the Nile Dam project. The giant hydropower dam project sparked a diplomatic row between Cairo and Addis Ababa. The ministers met in Washington for the third time and agreed to fill the $4 billion dam in stages. The ministers will hold technical and legal talks ahead of their meeting. Egypt fears the dam will restrict water supplies for the country's population of more than 100 million. Addis Ababa has, however, denied the claim. Our correspondent in Cairo, Adel El-Mahrouhi, has more.
Despite an ultimatum to reach an agreement by mid-January, Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan say they need more time. A new deadline to reach a final deal has been set to January 29 after a final meeting in Washington, D.C.
The final round of the U.S. talks comes after the Ethiopian Prime Minister asked South Africa to mediate in the Nile talks, which was clear that this round in Washington would not reach any concrete agreement, because Ethiopia appears to be already planning for their next move. Unfortunately, the process is being lengthened, which frustrates Egypt because the filling is expected in July.
After 3 days of intensive talks in the U.S. capital, some progress have been made. The countries have agreed on the principles that should strike a deal. Ethiopia should be committed to fill the dam's reservoir during the rainy season. That concept should be adaptable during cases of extreme drought, according to a statement from the U.S. Treasury, which hosted the talks.
Egypt wants an agreement on operation and filling of the dam, which doesn't cause any harm on Egyptian water security during the coming years. They also want prior agreement before Ethiopia begins to build any water construction or barriers over the Nile, because Egypt depends mainly on the Nile for water.
During the operation of the Ethiopia Dam, water released in the Nile stream should follow a mechanism based on the hydrological state of the Blue Nile to minimize the impact on the downstream Niles, Egypt and Sudan. The three countries should also agree in the next 2 weeks on a method to resolve disputes between them regarding the dam's operation. After 3 days of continuous negotiations, the three countries have only agreed on the principles to reach an agreement. But the details of implementation have always been the obstacles for a deal between these three countries. At least 2 more meetings will be held during the next 2 weeks. Both technical and political meetings will still be attended by the United States and the World Bank. Adel El-Mahrouhi, CGTN, Cairo.
Well, analysts have been weighing in on the issue surrounding the Grand Renaissance Dam. An Egyptian analyst believes dialogue is the only way to resolve the conflict.
It's very difficult to persuade the Ethiopians to stop the project completely or like to hold the whole project, but it would make more sense to reach a situation in which they would continue their project while at the same time offering the necessary guarantees for Egypt that its water, its historical water rights in the Nile will not be affected. as we all know, diplomacy and talks is not about getting everything or losing everything. No, it's about compromises. And I think this is key to the whole situation. So the project would remain in place, provided that the Ethiopians, I think, would give us more details, especially to the Egyptian delegation, on how this would make sure that everything is going on track and that all parties are satisfied with the final outcome.
Two other news now. Germany is set to host a conference in Berlin on Sunday to shore up support to the United Nations in its efforts to achieve peace in Libya. Well, the conference will involve the warring parties' rival camps, representatives from the UN, US, Russia, Britain, France and China, Turkey and Italy. Fayez al-Sarraj, who heads the Tripoli-based government, signed a truce proposal after talks through Turkish and Russian mediators in Moscow on Monday. But Khalifa Haftar, the general who leads the eastern-based Libyan National Army, left the Russian capital without signing. Meanwhile, Turkey says it's too early to say whether the ceasefire in Libya has collapsed. Turkey remains confident the temporary suspension of fighting, which came into force on Sunday, will hold despite Khalifa Haftar's refusal to sign a permanent truce. Since 2011, the conflict in Libya has wrecked the economy, disrupted oil production and triggered flows of migration to Europe. In other news, Turkey's foreign ministry has summoned Egypt's top diplomat in Ankara following a raid on the Anadolu agency in Cairo. Turkey's state-run news agency says 4 of its staff members have been detained. The media house has no information on their whereabouts. Egyptian police carried out the raid overnight on Tuesday. They shut down the agency's security cameras and internet and searched the premises. Egypt's Interior Ministry says it targeted the news agency as part of its efforts to expose the Muslim Brotherhood terrorist group and the countries which support it. Well, now let's get you more on this. We are now joined by CGTN's Mikhail Bar-David and Adel El-Makrouhi, who is in Cairo for us. Let's start with you, Mikhail, in Istanbul. What is the latest from Turkey regarding the summoning of the Egyptian envoy?
Well, we're still waiting for a statement from Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan, but he is speaking right now. He hasn't touched this topic yet, but we can expect a harsh statement from him as well. He's one of the biggest critics of Egypt. He refuses to be even in the same room or sit at the same table with President al-Sisi, so we can expect a harsh statement from him as well. But so far, the reactions have been from the Turkish Foreign Ministry mostly. They've condemned the raid and stated that it was an act of violence. They summoned the Egyptian charge d'affaires over the matter. In a statement, they've also stated that this act of violence against Anadolu not only shows Egyptian leadership's hostile stance towards the freedom of the press, but also once again shows its grave conditions on democracy and transparency. It also called on Egypt, of course, to immediately release those who have been detained from the Anadolu personnel. And there was also a statement from Turkey's communications director, Fahrettin Altun, who also labeled the raid as a hostile attempt against Anadolu's employees, but Egypt's coolest leadership. So harsh statements from there.
We don't have Adel in Cairo at the moment. So, Mikhail, let me ask you this. Let's switch focus now to Libya. What is the latest on Turkey's efforts for a truce in Libya and the deployment of troops to Tripoli?
Well, Turkey hasn't given a latest statement regarding the conditions of the troops. The last we had heard was from Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan, who had stated that the deployment of troops had gradually begun, but we don't have any details on that. However, right now in his speech, which is ongoing at the moment, Turkish President once again emphasized that Turkey would not be excluded from the Mediterranean. So it's clear that Erdogan wants to continue their harsh stance and be active so their maritime boundaries boundary agreement with the GNA is very relevant for Turkey that was signed between Erdogan and Fayez Sarraj, the Prime Minister of the GNA. Now, Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan also had a phone conversation with U.S. President Donald Trump on Wednesday. It was stated that they had discussed the latest developments in Libya, but no details were revealed regarding what they discussed other than that. Now, earlier in the week, Erdogan also had some threatening words to General Haftar of the Libyan National Army. He had stated that Turkey would not refrain from teaching him a lesson and that it was Turkey's duty to protect their kin in Libya. So we can expect that if the ceasefire fails, these efforts fail, then Turkey would continue in its stance and that it would not hesitate to take action, or at least this is the kind of message that Erdogan wants to give at the moment, even though they are confident regarding the ceasefire potentially holding for now, as we are all expecting now what will happen in Berlin in the conference that is now going to be very significant. Germany has invited leaders of both sides, both Fayez Sarraj from the GNA, but also Haftar from the LNA. And as you mentioned, now we're also expecting so many international members from the international community. The United States, Russia, France, China, the UAE, Turkey, and Italy will also be there. So it's going to be really significant to see whether or not they will be able to find a political solution, at least strategies to work in that way.
Okay, thank you very much for that update. That was CGTN's Mikhail Bardavid there in Istanbul. We have now resumed connection with Adel El Mahrouki, who is in Cairo for us. Adel, what provoked the raid on the Anadolu news agency, and also what's the status of the detained journalist?
So first of all, as far as Egypt is concerned, Anadolu News Agency does not have an office in Egypt. Since 2013, they have not been registered as an office, a press office authorized to work in Egypt. No permits have been issued to that office since. And therefore, whatever operation has been going on according to the Egyptian law has not been going officially. The office itself is not attributed to an Anadolu agency, it's attributed to a political research center called SETA. It is a Turkish, maybe funded or based, but it has been in Egypt years ago, and according to the Egyptian Foreign Ministry, this location has been founded, the SETA Research Institute has been founded by members of the Muslim Brotherhood, which Egypt has designated as terrorist group. But the foundation itself of that office in general happened way before the Muslim Brotherhood was recognized as a terrorist organization by the Egyptian government. According to the government, they have raided that office because it has been sending news to Anadolu News Agency in an illegal way. That's a quote from the Egyptian government, and according to the statement as well, these news were falsified in a way that would damage Egypt's reputation in general. This is the official claim from the Egyptian government, and the reason they're justifying the incident that happened yesterday. And according to the whereabouts, one former member of the Egyptian press syndicate board said that one of the journalists, at least, has appeared in the Egyptian National Security Bureau for interrogation. So at least it seems that it is the whereabouts of the journalist is starting to become clear itself. The exact accusations and the causes of the investigation and how it will turn out as an investigation or a court case later on has not been revealed by the Egyptian government yet.
Adel, briefly, if you will, you did just mention the Muslim Brotherhood. Egypt's accusing Turkey of funding extremist groups in the region, which it designates as an extremist group. How is this related to the Anadolu crackdown?
Well, in general, there has been a political dispute or differences between Cairo and Ankara or Istanbul, between the two countries in general. And the main reason is that since 2013, after the Egyptian army ousted the Muslim Brotherhood leader and back then the president of Egypt, Mohammed Morsi, due to, of course, popular uprising, Turkey has been extremely critical of the move, and since then has been sheltering leaders, significant and prominent leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's beside President Erdogan's continuous clear criticism to President Sisi ever since in most of his international speeches in general. And that has developed a concept in Egypt that the Turkey in general is supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and is backing Islamist group. Of course, when the conflict became clearer in Libya, we've seen that Egypt is taking the side of General Khalifa Haftar, the LNA, and the eastern powers of Libya, while Turkey is taking the side of the Islamist militia and the government of national accord in the west. So it has become clearer of the stances, the political stances of both nations, and the core actually for the differences that the both countries perceive or see in the geopolitical area in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, and in general in the entire region. And that was one of the main reasons to spark that tension. In several cases, Egypt has been asking Turkey to hand over some of the detainees, some of the Muslim Brotherhood members that have been sheltered or staying or taking residence in Turkey, while Egyptian court cases have found them guilty in terrorism and other violence cases of incidents that took place after the 2013 ouster of President Morsi and after the evacuation of his protests or his supporters camp in Cairo. And that basically designs or draws a general picture about the nature of these relations between the two countries and how it has been affecting regional conflicts and the relationship between them in terms, for example, the Mediterranean conflict.
We'll have to leave it.
Turkey and Libya, the GNA, have decided to redraw the water borders in the Mediterranean.
Adel, thank you very much. That was CG10's Adel El Makrouki there in Cairo. Moving on to other news now. Ethiopia has proposed to hold its national elections on August the 16th. This will be the first poll under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who has eased political restrictions and taken steps to open up the economy since taking office in 2018. The Electoral Board says plans to hold the vote for Parliament and regional councils in May had been postponed as neither the authorities nor parties would be ready. One opposition political party has voiced concern that the new suggested date was unsuitable because it's a fasting day for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. President Donald Trump's impeachment trial will begin next week. The Democratic-led House of Representatives has sent 2 formal charges against him to the Senate. Trump is charged with abuse of power for asking Ukraine to investigate political rival Joe Biden. He's also accused of obstruction of Congress for blocking testimony and documents sought by Democratic lawmakers. He now becomes the 3rd president in the United States to be placed on trial in the Senate. The impeachment rules require a 2/3 majority in order to convict and remove a president. It's unlikely that this will happen as none of the 53 Republicans of the 100-seat Senate has voiced support for removing him.
We'll pledge to rise above the petty factionalism and do justice for our institutions, for our states, and for the nation. And then we will formally notify the White House of our pending trial and summon the President to answer the articles and send his counsel. So the trial will commence in earnest on Tuesday. This is a difficult time for our country, but this is precisely the kind of time for which the framers created the Senate. I'm confident this body can rise above short-termism and factional fever and serve the long-term best interest of our nation. We can do this, and we must.
We're going to a short break now. Don't go away. Lots more to come, including Ethiopia postpones national elections to August. And 1 year later, Kenya remembers victims of hotel attack in which 21 people were killed.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington Nairobi, and London. China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
The United States is calling for the UN to reduce peacekeeping troops in Mali. During a Security Council briefing on the country's peace process, a US representative called for a new approach to tackle violence in the country. This follows a number of terrorist attacks on soldiers and UN forces in the region in recent weeks. Sarah Walton reports now from New York.
At a briefing to the Security Council at the UN headquarters on Wednesday, the UN's peacekeeping chief said the security situation in Mali and the surrounding region is deteriorating at an alarming rate. Just last week, 18 peacekeepers were wounded in an attack on a UN camp, and 89 Nigerian soldiers were killed in an attack by suspected jihadists near the Malian border.
We have seen an increase in improvised explosive device attacks against our convoys, which have resulted in several injuries to peacekeepers. These incidents occur almost daily, or at least very regularly.
The UN peacekeeping chief said continued implementation of the country's peace agreement remains the only viable path for stability in Mali. But the United States Deputy Ambassador to the UN Security Council, Cherith Norman Chalet, said it was time to start developing an alternative approach to addressing growing instability in the country. And she said peacekeeping missions are not the answer for growing terrorist threats. Russia and France both countered quickly, giving their support to the peacekeeping operation known as MINUSMA.
It performs functions that no other actor is in a position to ensure, whether in terms of the protection of civilians, support for the implementation of the peace agreement, and for logistical support to the G5 Sahel joint force. The mission has sustained tremendous losses, and I welcome the commitment of the countries contributing to the G5 Sahel joint force troops and their soldiers.
The 15,000 UN peacekeepers in Mali have been deployed since 2013, with an annual budget of $1 billion. And the country's foreign affairs minister told the Security Council that their presence is more important now than ever.
The increase in terrorist attacks in recent weeks in the Sahel region, particularly in the three Burkina, Mali, Niger borders, underlines the urgent need for the international community to invest more on both sides in order to provide the joint forces of the G5 Sahel with the human, material and financial resources necessary for the implementation of its mandate.
The Malian minister also reassured the Security Council that the Malian government remains committed to the implementation of the peace agreement and that those involved in that process will be meeting again in the capital Bamako on Sunday. Sarah Walton, CGTN, New York.
Meanwhile, the French Armed Forces Minister is expected in Washington in the coming days to discuss security in the Sahel. The visit comes amid growing concern of a US exit from the area. The US provides intelligence, logistical and drone support to the French forces. France has at least 4,500 troops in Mali and the wider Sahel. Security has worsened, however. Militants linked to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State have strengthened their foothold, stoking ethnic violence, especially in Mali and Burkina Faso. To Nigeria now, and the country has marked its 50th Armed Forces anniversary in the capital, Abuja. The ceremony celebrated the selfless efforts of its servicemen and women. Tributes were paid especially to those killed in the line of duty. CGTN's Kelechi Emekulam reports.
A formal ceremony to honor Nigeria's fallen heroes, servicemen and women who laid down their lives to defend the territorial integrity of the nation. President Muhammadu Buhari leads other government officials to perform the wreath-laying ceremony.
It culminated into this grand finale, which is the laying of wreath at the National Arcade to honor the fallen heroes and appreciate members of the armed forces and security agencies.
There were several other high points, like the 21-gun salute for the slain soldiers and the ritual release of white doves signifying peace, harmony and mutual coexistence. Rated as the world's third most terrorized country, it's been an enormous task for the nation's military. Hundreds of soldiers have been killed by terrorist groups Boko Haram and ISWAP in the decade-long war against insurgency.
The day that the government has set aside to remember the fallen heroes, that the sacrifice, the supreme price they pay for the nation is never forgotten. So it gives us some hope that we are not forgotten as well.
A soldier feels cold, but he still stands bold. They die for our nation. Our story should be told.
This year's ceremony cuts across board. For the first time, bringing key players from the entertainment industry in a concert held in honor of Nigerian soldiers.
First, I want to thank them for that sacrifice. That is a human sacrifice to the nation.
The Nigerian army has been highly criticized for not doing enough, especially to end insurgency. But this week-long event has set a different tone in the country and its people. A tone of appreciation from citizens, as well as government's commitment to improve the welfare of serving troops and those slain for the benefit of their families. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
Here in Kenya, it's been a year since Al-Shabaab militants staged an attack on a hotel in the capital, Nairobi, killing 21 people. On the first anniversary of the attack, families of those who were killed are finding ways to keep the memories of their loved ones alive. CT10's Wilkista Nyabwa reports.
Outside Diana's window, everything looks the same as it did last year. But inside, everything is different. The last year has been full of adjustments. This is the first anniversary of her husband's death. James Odwo Radido was a journalist, an avid football fanatic and sportsman, and a father of two. His larger-than-life personality meant he had a large circle of friends.
Odu was a very jovial person, extremely. He was full of life. There was never a dull moment.
James, known to close friends as Odu Cobra, was at the electronics company where he worked on 14 Riverside Drive when attackers from Somalia's Al-Shabaab militant group struck. His wife remembers as if it were yesterday, the moment a friend broke the news of the attack to her.
And somebody called her to tell her that there has been an attack at Dusit. And I remember her face, looking so worried and shocked.
James didn't make it out of the building alive. The year since his death has been hard for his family.
To be the mother and father of our children. To literally be the everything of this home without him. It has not been easy.
It is a sentiment repeated over and over by survivors and those who lost their loved ones in the attack. 21 civilians died that day. The memories linger, each finding their own way to cope with the grief. Some found comfort at work. The complex has since reopened for business. For Diana, comfort has come from her children. And Wadao TV, the online sports station her husband started shortly before his death.
I might not have the same passion as he did, but I really try. I really try to work with the few people that I know in sports who are really aligned with his vision to keep his memory alive through that channel for the outside world.
On the first anniversary, James's family and friends have planned a series of memorial events, a memorial service, a dinner and a get-together at home. It's painful to remember, but it is in remembering that they keep their memories of their loved ones alive. Wilkista Nyabwa, CGTN.
All of the business news coming up for you after the break, including experts call Phase 1 deal between China and the US beneficial to world economy. And Total South Africa plans to drill the deepest offshore well in Angola. Yeah.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector. Problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Let's start with China. Many American economists and officials believe the signing of the deal could help stimulate the global economy by eliminating a major uncertainty.
I think the uncertainty will decrease and we'll have a return to some improvement in capital investment, so a moderate recovery in industrial production in the United States, probably some significant improvement in countries that are oriented towards capital goods exports, like, for example, Germany, Japan, and South Korea.
And I think that will be a plus for business sentiment. It will be a plus for global growth as we look into 2020, as we take away one of the more significant concerns and risks.
We both win by seeing the trade war end. There are no winners by seeing the trade war continue, both for the Chinese people and the people of America. We believe there's a great possibility that this can come to a conclusion and we can go back to being great trade partners with each other.
It gives us a platform on which we can help to build a stronger, more sustainable U.S.-China bilateral relationship in economics and business, but also beyond.
Well, CGTN's Uche Okoronkwe examines the impact that the China-US trade spat has had on the African continent. Let's now take a look.
There is a popular African adage that goes, when elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. Now, though Africa was not the direct target of the US-China trade war and has remained largely absent from the discourse, the reality is African nations are now facing a mixture of opportunity and harm to their economies. And here's why. Now, these trade tariffs have typically led to significant drops in commodity prices, local currencies, as well as major equity exchanges on the continent. But Africa could also feel that commodities export gap left by the US in China itself. It also presents an opportunity for policymakers and stakeholders to redouble reform efforts and create an investment environment on the continent that will see Africa boost its position on the global supply chain. Still, most economic experts believe this trade war has done more harm than good to the continent. Last year, the African Development Bank warned that the trade conflict could result in a 2.5% drop in the GDP of resource-intensive African nations and a 1% fall for oil exporters in the next 2 years. That's because over 60% of Africa's exports go to the US, China, and Europe, and more than 70% of Africa's imports originate from these countries. For example, the tariffs imposed on steel and aluminium by the US has directly affected South Africa's industry. In 2017, almost $400 million worth of aluminium and just below $1 billion worth of steel was exported from South Africa to the US. Now, this trade war has put nearly 8,000 jobs in the steel and aluminium sector at risk, and that's unless new markets are now found. Now, we can't also ignore that China has become the continent's leading trading partner. In 2018, China's total import and export volume with Africa was just over $200 billion US. That's a year-on-year increase of almost 20%. Today, China's loans to several African nations is in excess of $1 billion US. Now, when tariffs are imposed on Chinese-made products, Chinese production slows down, and that means growth in African nations, which rely on China's need for resources for a chunk of their exports, is now stifled, especially nations such as South Sudan, Gambia, Guinea, and Zimbabwe, where more than 40% of their exports go to China. Also, as the trade war rages on, China's capital account surplus and its forex reserves will fall, and that could result in less aid and investment to Africa going forward. Now, there's been some debate as to whether African nations can benefit from the trade war and possibly fill some of those export gaps which are left by the US and China. Hefty tariffs on Chinese textiles could boost African textile manufacturers. Also, Chinese tariffs on U.S. agricultural products could open the door for outflows of value-add agricultural products, such as, of course, Kenyan avocados or Namibian beef. Now, critics are saying most African nations are not competitive nor have the capacity to replace U.S. and Chinese firms. For example, South African exporters of wine, fruits, or even nuts are a ready market, but their yield remains too low to satisfy global demand. Now, arguably, there is another upside to the scuffle between these two global giants. The two are now competing to strengthen their economic ties within Africa. FDI flows from both countries to Africa will be critical in creating jobs and, of course, speeding up the continent's industrial revolution.
So to recap, China and the US have signed phase 1 of an agreement that will begin to ease the long-running trade war between the two economic powers. CG10's Nathan King in Washington has the latest on what the deal means for both countries.
Essentially, there's a feeling of relief here that there was a deal, because remember, back in May, both sides walked away from the table. But this deal, this phase 1 deal, which I've read most of now, nearly 94 pages, it does cover a lot of ground. And remember, the US president is fixated on the trade deficit, and while China says it wants to buy more as its economy changes from an export-led low-wage one to a more of a consumption-driven middle-income one, they seem to have come up with this deal for $200 billion worth of extra goods coming from the US, if market conditions allow, from 2017 levels over the next 2 years. And, you know, it's worried the whole global economy. And US president said, look, this is not just good for China, not just good for the US, but will help confidence in the global economy.
We are going to work together, and we're going to work together for the benefit of our countries, but also, very importantly, for the benefit of the world. So this is a very big day for the United States. It's a very big day for China. This is a day that nobody thought could happen.
There were arguments, but we respect and cooperate with each other as well. We both have clear goals to eventually reach an agreement on the basis of the interests of the two nations' peoples. I think this is the result of a rational negotiation, and this rationality deserves to be promoted.
Now, you know, obviously tariffs remain on both sides. 2/3 of Chinese imports into the US are still under some sort of tariff ranging from 7.5% to 25%. But, you know, a lot more tariffs could have been in place from both sides. This is more than a pause. This is a rollback. And also, this deal, if you look at it, offers a roadmap going forward, and also dispute settlement mechanisms, and also sets up an architecture for more structured talks between China and the US going forward as well, to try and avoid some of the misunderstandings that we had at the beginning of the trade tensions. There are lots of outstanding issues on the economic front and the political front, although let's just stick with economics. Phase 2 would include some real problems for the United States and China. The United States wants to address what it calls unfair subsidies to state-owned enterprises in China, cheap loans, cheaper electricity, also other market access issues. China, for its part, wants to continue guarantees for access of US tech, and also be able to invest here in the United States. There have been rules put in place just this week which would limit that. The question is, when will this deal be done? Now, there's lots of talk that this deal could be split up into phase 2A, phase 2B, phase 2C, and tariffs could be rolled back incrementally. That would actually be a confidence building measure. But remember, it's an election year here in the United States, and the US president might just want to wave this in front of the electorate and say this is a win, and come back to the table later on if he is re-elected in November. But US President Trump says he is going to Beijing soon, and that there are negotiations going to start. When he will go, we do not know. One would assume sometime after the Lunar New Year, and obviously the two sessions in Beijing. So we'll see. Look out for that announcement.
French oil major Total will drill the world's deepest offshore well in Angola, in waters more than 2 miles deep, as the African country works to reverse years of declining output. The The well will be 228 metres deeper than Total's Raya 1 well in Uruguay, completed in 2016. Production in Angola has slumped by a third in the past decade, following years of underinvestment for new projects. Total has positioned itself to be the country's top foreign operator as it mulls billions of dollars of future spending there. Total has hired the Maersk Voyager rig for its drilling campaign in southern Africa, which comprises 2 wells in Angola and 1 in Namibia. Ethiopian Airlines will start constructing a new $5 billion airport later this year. This is because the rapidly expanding carrier has outgrown its capacity at the current base in Addis Ababa. The airport will be built in Bishoftu, a town 39 kilometers southeast of the capital, Addis Ababa. It'll have the capacity to handle 100 million passengers a year. Ethiopia's Bole International Airport in the capital has a passenger capacity of about 19 million passengers annually. State-owned Ethiopian Airlines has 116 aircraft in its fleet. Its net profit rose to $260 million in its 2018-19 financial year from $207.2 million a year before. Still on aviation matters, Egypt Air has resumed flights to Baghdad after 3 days of suspension. Egypt's flag carrier had temporarily halted flights to Baghdad following tensions between the US and Iran over the killing of an Iranian general. Yasser Hakim has the details.
The decision by Egypt Air to cancel flights to Baghdad was based on security concerns, and it proved worthwhile. 2 days later, a Ukrainian passenger jet had been mistakenly hit by an Iranian rocket, and all on board were killed.
The airlines take precautionary measures to safeguard their planes and passengers. The procedures require that the airline notifies the target cities and international authorities of any cancellations, in this case Iraq, followed by informing the passengers ahead of time.
Several other airlines such as Lufthansa and Air France have also temporarily suspended flights to Baghdad. This came after the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad. The travel bans are meant to keep the passengers safe, but at the same time they have had a strong economic impact on the airlines in the region. Libya, Yemen and Syria are just some of the countries in the region where airlines had to suspend flights on several occasions. Flight cancellations cause a setback in revenue for the fiercely competitive international airlines.
These are major losses for the industry. Cancelling just 1 or 2 flights can cost the company $200,000. To cut out losses, some airlines provide an option for its clients. It offers to take the passengers to a nearby city or country, which is safer to land in as an alternative.
In spite of the economic impact, flight cancellations for security reasons will remain a priority. Financial losses from a cancelled route are minimal compared to a plane crash and loss of lives. Yas Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
We're going to a short break now. Don't go away. Lots more to come, including... We tell you how global warming is making life harder for Tunisian sea sponge fishermen.
Join us in Global Business and see Africa through our eyes.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Qanater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
To To Tunisia now, where fishermen have been driven into deeper waters in order to harvest sea sponges living on the coral reef. This is because the sea sponge is being forced into deeper waters by a disease that locals believe is linked to pollution and global warming. The natural sea sponges are biodegradable and commonly used in body washing. CGTN's Adnan Shuashi explains why the high-risk trade has continued for decades.
Many boats are at rest at the port of the southern fishing town of Zerzis in Tunisia. Fishermen say the quantity of sea sponge has decreased by 70%. Only 4 years ago, 40 boats used to harvest sea sponge in this region. Now only 14 are still in the business.
This is due to the catastrophe of the mysterious blight which killed the crop. Fishermen can no longer work on the Tunisian coast. We harvest sea sponge in international waters, 30 miles off the Italian coast, where it's legal. Sea sponge is rare on our side of the Mediterranean.
Kamel learned sea sponge harvesting from his ancestors. Now he exports his harvest to Europe and Asia. The fisherman says the price of some sponge species can reach $200. However, rising sea temperature is causing damage to his activity.
The boat leaves the port of Zarzis and crosses 280 miles to harvest the elephant ear sponge. We spend 2 days at large to reach the right location. We plunge between 50 and 60 meters because the sponge lives in cold water. Global warming affects sea temperatures and decimates the crop. It's a risky job.
A scientific team from the National Institute of Marine Sciences and Technologies in the capital city Tunis has been trying to answer the questions of fishermen. A study has recently been conducted in Zerzis, as well as in the islands of Jerba and Qarqna. Karim Ben Mustafa is one of the leading sea sponge experts in the Mediterranean basin. He says recent findings have moved the research team a step closer to unraveling the mysteries of this powerful disease and the sponge mass mortalities.
This is mainly due to the absence of thermocline, which is normally present in seawater. It's a temperature barrier which protects the sea sponges by keeping a constant temperature. Warming water temperatures modify the metabolism and physiology of sponge communities. It makes them fragile to viruses and fungi, while their immunity is weak.
The sea sponge harvesting season lasts 10 months. It's a seasonal sea activity from June until the end of April, but fishermen can only work for 3 to 5 months per season. They hope that sponge mass mortalities will stop in order to preserve their ancestral marine activity. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
All of the sports news coming up for you after the break, including South Africa's Proteas begin third test against England in Port Elizabeth.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find your game.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Earlier on Thursday, South Africa and England went into the third test match of the 4-match series level at 1 win apiece, with both sides eager to get a result in order to prevent a series loss. Fresh from victory in Cape Town, the visitors won the toss and elected a bat, but the pressure will be on the Proteas to bounce back with a win. Before the action got underway, CGTN's CS du Plessis previewed the match.